Thanks for listening to the FU Cancer Podcast. My name is Christina Rollins. I'm a dietitian, mom, and wife to a pretty awesome cancer survivor. We said FU to cancer nearly 25 years ago and are still going strong. I'm excited to share the FU Cancer movement, where we are a community of survivors, fighters, caregivers, and advocates, connecting our shared experiences, passion, and determination to live a holistic and well-balanced life. Stay tuned, because we've got a lot to talk about. Hey everyone, welcome back to the FU Cancer Podcast. In today's episode, we're diving into one of the most powerful tools in a healthcare practitioner's toolbox, clinical research. Specifically, we're looking at how research is reshaping what we know about nutrition and cancer care. And to help us do that, I'm joined by somebody who's working at the forefront of research, LJ Amaral, a registered dietitian and certified specialist in oncology nutrition. After nearly a decade of working with patients, she has led and supported cutting-edge clinical trials through Cedars-Sinai Center for Integrated Research in Cancer and Lifestyle. Her work is helping us understand how food and lifestyle can reduce side effects, improve treatment outcomes in cancer care, and even play a role in cancer prevention. And interestingly, this past August, she stepped down from her role to pursue her PhD in biomedical science and translational research at a local university. LJ, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to FU Cancer.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with what inspired your shift from clinical care to research.
I felt like it was one of those things. I had an exposure to research in my graduate degree, and I did really like it. I just didn't know how to make it a career. And so when I had the opportunity to work in research and you get that taste, you kind of get hooked if it's for you, I think. And so I figured it was really difficult to manage a 50% clinical load and a 50% research load. And so little by little, the clinical load started to get inched out. And so it seemed like the best and most logical next step to pursue a higher degree and be able to do the research studies that, I'm most interested in, instead of being a part of a team and waiting on that, for things to happen.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that you're currently involved in research on glioblastoma and mixed CNS malignancies. So what makes these types of cancers particularly important or challenging, really from a nutritional standpoint?
Yeah, I think what's really challenging is, especially within the brain tumor community, there aren't a lot of studies that are specifically dedicated to looking at nutrition or nutritional interventions for cancer, specifically glioblastoma or CNS malignancies or brain tumors in particular. So there aren't a lot of studies out there because it's considered a more rare brain tumor, or I'm sorry, more considered a more rare tumor. So it's difficult to fund those kinds of research studies. And then also it's really difficult because we don't know what actually crosses the blood-brain barrier for a lot of different things. And so I think with nutrition, there is some dogma that, of course, certain nutrients can cross the blood-brain barrier, but, really looking at that synergize with cancer treatment within the context of brain tumors that exhibit a lot of inflammation too, or fatigue, which can be mediated by diet. It seemed kind of like the next best step. As well as the fact that with the particular diet that we're looking at, it's implicated in the use of seizures, and that's usually one of the number one side effects that we see for brain tumor patients.
Well, we often hear about dietary interventions as an adjunct or supplement to standard of care cancer treatment. So can you explain what that really looks like in practice?
Yeah, so basically it's saying that we're not going to do anything different aside from adding a dietary intervention. So if you were to go to your oncologist and say, hey, I just got diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, I need to start treatment, you would be doing that exact same treatment with the addition of a dietary intervention, whether that's a supplement or a specific diet or a specific food intervention. So it's basically in conjunction with your treatment. And so you're not ever just getting a nutritional intervention for your treatment. You're also getting standard conventional medicine as well.
Okay. Well, walk us through one of the trials that you're currently working on, maybe something that you're really excited about in the cancer field.
Yeah. So I think one of the most exciting studies that I've been a part of is a phase 2 randomized clinical trial that's at multiple sites throughout the country looking at a high fat ketogenic diet versus a high fiber American Cancer Society diet in glioblastoma patients. So, we've kind of seen this story play out since the beginning. Our department was one of the first to published a case series on the mixed CNS malignancies and the ketogenic diet. And then we also just published a phase 1, so looking at feasibility and whether or not these patients can tolerate taking a ketogenic diet with their chemotherapy and radiation. And so this phase 2 is really seeing, is this actually efficacious? So we have patients from all over the world essentially who are interested in implementing a diet to help themselves with their cancer treatment. And so I think what's really exciting to me is that we actually are going to be able to answer that question. And so whether the answer to that question is quote unquote positive or negative, it's going to give us really good information that will be able to give people, the ability to make more informed choices for themselves.
Well, at Cedars-Sinai, you weren't just doing clinical trials, but you were writing and reviewing cancer and diet protocols, working on grants, that kind of thing. So, what does that process look like? And how do you make sure that, kind of globally speaking, nutrition has a seat at the research table?
Yeah, I think I am in a very unique situation. I think Cedars is a very cutting edge institution, and they really value and see the impact that nutrition can have, especially within the context of cancer. So it wasn't a hard sell, to get nutrition on the table. And lucky for me, my boss or principal investigator, Stephen Friedland, is extremely involved in nutrition for cancer, especially within prostate cancer. So, it's really, I think, important for dietitians to find physician champions who also have this interest and are willing to kind of push the agenda forward, with you kind of being the squeaky wheel at the bay as well. But it's really interesting. And I think it highlights just how many people have to come into play, for a nutrition trial to come off the ground and actually be successful. There are just so many variables that you have to consider and so many different things that you have to consider, especially when we're talking about active chemotherapy treatments, and just making sure that we're being safe and that we're not risking harm for the patients. And so I think it's been very eye-opening. It's a lot of reading, but it's been a very interesting way to just see how much goes into the results of these trials.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to work on a couple of very small local trials, and it's a huge amount of work, very tedious, very attention to detail, and you really don't glean that effort
Right.
when you read the final manuscript. You have no
Right.
idea of the years that went into getting to that point.
Yeah. And just how regimented things are. Everything really has to be per protocol. And so, especially coming from a standpoint of, you're running trials at different places around the country, it's really important to make sure that standardization is happening across all sites so that every patient is kind of considered getting the exact same treatment plan.
And when you say that, right, every site has someone like you, a principal investigator, leading it, but everybody has to be synced up with their work, right? So it all
Yeah,
is consistent across the board.
exactly.
So I think that's a really great segue to my next question, because I don't think that the average person on the street realizes how tightly regulated clinical research is. So what
Yeah.
does it take to get a nutrition focused trial off the ground, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think the first primary focus would be to find the preclinical evidence to show that there's some sort of traction behind your idea. So that would really be looking at, like animal models or cell line culture models, just looking at, is this, does this actually make sense? Can we actually think about, oh, if we're using a ketogenic diet, why. We can't just like do whatever we want because we think it's a great idea. I love that for us, but we don't have the funding for it. But just really making sure that there's logic behind what you're proposing and the mechanism of action in which you see in these preclinical trials. And then I think it's just really making sure that you're accounting for pretty much all the variables that you can so that diet is really the only thing that's being changed between the groups so that you can really try to elicit if nutrition is the reason why you're seeing a difference between the groups. And I think that's the most important thing when you're creating a nutrition related study is trying to make the groups as even as possible, and even trying to account for like attrition rates. So if you're doing an intervention versus a control, how do you make the control like a little bit more attractive? Because if you're signing up for a study and you're expected to give, and you're being altruistic, you're giving your time, you're giving your samples, and you're not getting anything out of it really, but the other group is getting a scale or a fit, but you try to keep the scale as even as possible so that people are getting literally the exact same thing except for the intervention.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's pivot and talk outcomes. So, what are the most exciting or promising findings coming out of this research so far?
I think so far it's been very interesting. I started doing this research 10 years ago. So this was pre-keto being a fad. And so when I first started, it was really difficult. It was an upstream battle, trying to get people to get on this like high fat train, so to speak. I think a lot of us, especially if we're in a certain age group, low fat is the way. That is the life that we know and love. So getting people to eat high fat was really challenging. I
Mm-hmm.
think that, and so how that has changed and transformed how many people are willing to do this has been very eye-opening and interesting. What we found, I think, that is really interesting is in the case series, even though it was a really small proportion of patients that we got for this case series, the patients that did the diet intervention, even though they were on cancer related treatment, actually saw either stabilization or improvements in their fatigue. And normally, when people go through treatment, we see, their fatigue just tank. They're super tired all the
Mm-hmm.
time. So it was really interesting to see that. And I think just some other offshoot outcomes that are really interesting, like some people had improved sleep, which I thought was really interesting. And so we may be manipulating people's outcomes, not necessarily directly. Like of course there are studies that show beta hydroxybutyrate or the ketone body that comes from eating a high fat diet can induce changes within tumor microenvironment or inflammation. But if we're improving people's sleep, maybe that's making them less stressed or more able to eat the next day, or they're able to stay more active. So there are other ways in which I think the diet can be utilized if people are getting a benefit, despite whether or not we see if it's efficacious.
Well, I understand too that kind of just looking at your background and knowing what I know about your research, you're really taking an integrative approach where you're combining the clinical trials with the basic science and then just epidemiology in general. So, how
Yes.
does that big picture perspective help move our field forward?
So I think it's really important to have these kinds of trials. I mean, these are also like, I think there are trials that happen in an ideal world. Um, they're not always super common, but when we have this integration of all of these different facets and we're gathering all of this data and we're getting patients from all different parts of the country, and especially in the sample size and the number of patients that we have for this trial in particular, I think it makes a pretty big difference in terms of interpretation. So instead of taking the results, let's say from the case series or the phase one, which are nice, but they're not necessarily something that we can take to the clinic and say, hey, you can change your practice now. So,
Mhm.
getting these results can be practice changing, especially as we continue to go up in the ranks. And so I think that's why these types of trials are super important because they do have the ability to potentially change, our standard of care.
Mhm. So, for our listeners who are likely cancer patients, cancer caregivers, What would you say is a practical takeaway from all of the research? So, everything that we know from clinical research, and how close are we from taking the research applications to the real world and actually using it in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's hard. I'd say the one thing that I would say, if I could say to pretty much everyone across the board, is that nutrition does matter and it can make a difference. So, no matter what type of tumor you have, stage, age, sex, treatment, what you eat can have an effect on your outcomes, whether it's how you feel or how you take the treatment or um, how you sleep, it can make a big difference. And so I would really encourage patients or caregivers or what have you to use that to their advantage, with a caveat, of course, like you don't want to like become perfectionistic and become obsessive with your eating, but, use it as an adjunct, use it as a tool to really, you maybe quell some anxieties that you have or feel like you're making a difference, or yeah, just trying to make yourself feel better. I think we are super far away because there's so much that we still need to figure out in terms of nutrition for cancer. And I think it's going to end up being a very personalized model. And my hope and dream is to find a way to make it like an algorithm. So, taking all of your past medical history and your current medical history and your symptoms and likes, just, the whole thing, and be able to give you a prescription, really. But we are so far away from that. We're still not even at a point where we can confidently say, X diet is great for X cancer, or if you eat X food or have X amount of vitamin D in your blood, you're less likely to get this certain, so we're so far away from making those types of claims. I think we really need to just kind of focus on the things that we do know and the things that we know that make us feel better, and things that are within our control.
Mhm. Well, you've given us so much great information. Thank you for sharing all this research information with us. So, one last question before we wrap up. For those listening who want to support research or get involved with your kind of work, whether it's a patient, a practitioner, or a donor, what advice would you give them?
That's a great question. I would say, in terms of getting involved in research, I would say try to find charities that you're interested in. So, like the Susan G. Komen is a huge breast cancer research fund. You can find like the Brain Tumor Charity Fund or the American Institute for Cancer Research, or the Brain Tumor Brain Tumor Alliance, ABTA, I think that is. So finding your organizations and being able to make donations that directly support research, I think could be a way to get involved. Or looking at your local hospital and seeing if there's a way for you to fund certain trials, or reach out to specific PIs in general if you like their research and have the ability to make a private donation. I think we're definitely in a time where that is going to be needed, unfortunately, with specific funding cuts.
Mhm.
But I think it would be really amazing to be able to crowdfund from citizens who are interested.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for being here today. It's been so great to hear about your work, and just best wishes as you go forward with your program and all the amazing research that I'm sure we'll be doing in the future. So thank
Thank
you.
you so much. I really appreciate it.
And listeners, be sure to check out our website at fucancer.health. We have a lot of education modules, all rooted in evidence-based research, waiting for you to log in and join. So take a look when you get a chance. And until next time, I'm Christina Rollins. Thanks for listening.